This is The News Agents.
Welcome back. And we're going to talk about protests. And it's not the first time we've discussed this issue on the podcast because, of course, Suella Braverman kind of introduced new laws about limiting what was legal protest just ahead of the coronation. And we saw the appalling scenes, I thought, of protesters who wanted to say, "Not my king," and they all got arrested. And I thought that that was a kind of very, very counterproductive move. And of course, we're going to talk about climate change because, as well, who doesn't think that climate change is a very serious problem that global leaders need to tackle and that populations need to tackle because of the effect of CO2 and global warming. But the protests are often alienating people who even might be considered the types of people who would want to rally to their cause. This is a cyclist in London who was very unimpressed.
I'm a Liberal, I've always voted Liberal, and a cyclist, and I live in North London. And you all feel better about yourself, but you're hurting the cause. You feel better, but you're hurting the cause.
But what is the right way to get that message across?
Yeah, and the way that increasingly this debate is going, and the thing which punctuates this debate most at the moment, it seems, is, of course, these various groups, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, who have orchestrated at times civil disobedience, and not just protest, but also, blocking roads, disrupting sporting events, and so on. And they are fascinating groups because they've emerged, most of them are very, very new. They've emerged only in recent years, often lots of young people involved, and they are, in our experience anyway, they are so fervent in their belief of the justice of what they're doing. And so we thought it might be quite interesting to get one of them in to explore the principles involved about the civil disobedience they're orchestrating.
Well, we're joined in the studio now by Indigo Rumbelow. She's a spokesperson for Just Stop Oil. What are you hoping to achieve with your protests? Is it to win the support of the public?
We are demanding that the UK government stops issuing licences for new fossil fuel projects in the UK.
I understand that's the policy, though. What are you hoping to achieve in terms of public opinion?
Well, we're hoping to see this policy become legislation, and we're waiting for when that's going to happen. And we know that the majority of the public do support our demand.
So public opinion, very favourable towards you, is 4%, somewhat favourable 12%. So that's 16%, and somewhat unfavourable, very unfavourable, don't know, haven't heard of you, is the rest of it. So when you say that majority of people support you, what's that based on?
Sorry, this is the trap that many people fall down when they're looking at social change movements and how change happens. It's equating support for the group with support for the group's demand. Many people hated the suffragettes while they were taking action, but obviously the idea of women's suffrage was something that people want. Many people really hate and dislike the fact that we've been disrupting sporting events, the oil moving around this country, and also roads. But by virtue of the fact that the issue is spoken about everywhere, all of the time, and people are forced to either defend their position.
But that was why my question was very specific to you.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Which is, what were you hoping to achieve in terms of public opinion? Because you're just saying to me, no, you accept that people hate your tactics.
I'm accepting that people don't like our tactics, they don't like their days being disrupted, but I'm also saying that independent research has shown that our actions are increasing support for climate action.
I mean, you mentioned the suffragettes. Is it they that you compare yourself to? Is there a sort of particular kind of group that you wish to emulate in that regard? Are there others?
I wish there was a moment in history I could look back on and say that the issue that we're campaigning on, just try and stop climate catastrophe, was a parallel issue, and there just isn't. We're in a completely unprecedented moment in time.
So that's interesting. So you think that in a way, the moral legitimacy of what you're doing and the political legitimacy of what you're doing is precisely because there is no parallel or there is no precedent that can be drawn upon. That's what gives you the moral imperative and legitimacy to do what you do.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that to break the law, you have to have a very good reason. Most of the people in Just Stop Oil, there's vicars, teachers, doctors, So they would say that on the whole, people want to obey the law. The thing is that the public order at the moment is threatening the common good. The way things in which we're going is going to undermine everything.
Yeah, that's so interesting what you've just said. And they're stopping people on roads who may be on 0 hours contracts from getting paid because you've blocked them into wherever, and you're playing God on whether people get to hospital appointments or can get to funerals or the like. The sporting event is one thing. What you did at the snooker.
I don't know what that was for. Terrible scenes here at the Crucible.
It was a visually compelling protest, and I've seen it done at cricket matches over the decades. Anti-apartheid groups were doing it in the 60s and 70s. I think it's blocking the roads. There was an incident on the Old Kent Road where someone says, I've got to get to a hospital appointment, and the Just Stop Oil protester says, I don't believe you.
He does have a hospital appointment, can you just Yes.
I don't believe that's the case.
He needs to go.
Would you defend that?
I wouldn't defend that, no. We have a blue lights policy as an organisation, which means that if we see blue lights, we open up the flow of the traffic.
This was someone who was a private person going to a hospital appointment, and one of the Just Stop Oil protesters said, I do not believe you're going to a hospital appointment.
So we're disrupting ordinary people's lives. I accept that, and I accept that having to do that
if it was
is a
your
very,
mum who couldn't get to a hospital appointment for something quite urgent because Just Stop Oil protesters were blocking the road, how would you feel?
I personally would understand, even if it was my mum, and that's because what we're talking about coming down the line within my lifetime by 2030 is billions of people living outside of livable temperatures.
Well, I'm not arguing with the science or the threat posed. I'm arguing with the tactics which I believe are alienating people, and I quoted you those numbers in the opinion poll, which seem to suggest that only 16% of the British public have either a very favourable or somewhat favourable view of what you do. The rest either don't know or are very unfavourable.
I think it's key that people have to pick a side. Lewis, what do you think? Do you think we need to end new oil and gas?
No, what I'd say, Nico, is this. Do you understand that when you say, and in a way I admire your principle and the consistency of your belief. It's very admirable. When you say that, to answer John's question, you would understand, even if your mother was afflicted or affected by someone blocking the road. Do you understand, though, that for many people they will find that incomprehensible? That does make you sound, if anything, rather frenzied, because it's just so completely alien to the way most people would think. Most people would think, God, if my mum were being put in mortal danger by someone's political action, that they would abhor it.
It's a moral choice that we all have to make, yeah? And we have to decide whether we're going to stand up against a Tory government which is pursuing new oil and gas in the middle of the climate crisis, despite the warnings that this is going to kill billions of people, or if we're going to sit by and just pretend that we have no power, we can't do anything about it, and we're just going to watch this very, very pivotal moment in history just pass us by.
I'm interested in what you said about the thing about moral imperative, that you feel that because this is an unprecedented situation of such moral and political urgency that it justifies what you're doing. Can you see that there may be many other people who think exactly the same thing? So, for example, if you are anti-abortion, you may feel, and indeed they do feel, may disagree with it or agree with it, but they feel that this is a matter of the utmost moral importance.
It's murder.
It's murder. That's what they think. It's murder. They believe that millions and millions of children are being killed, every year across the world. So they could be sat in your chair right now and saying exactly the same thing, that this is of an unparalleled moral situation, and we're therefore justified in doing exactly what you're doing. It's subjective. That's the problem, isn't it?
Do you think that the climate crisis is subjective?
No, I don't think it's subjective.
I'm just making the point. We're just making the point that these people believe it is murder.
I concede, the point.
So just to be specific,
because we believe in free speech.
I'm making let me get the question. The specific question is: would you support the right of anti-abortion protesters to block the roads because they believe in their hearts it is murder?
Yes, I do support that. Yeah, that's what the Article 10 and 11 is, that we have. That's our right to free speech, our right to assembly, our right to protest. That's what our democracy is built upon.
So we could have a situation where no one can go anywhere because people have taken it upon themselves to say, I can block the King's Highway because I believe this. I can block the King's Highway because I believe that. It's mayhem.
Have you come round now and you've seen that blocking the highway does work? And that's why people would want to do it?
I think that you are turning people off the cause. I think that I don't disagree with you about the profound importance of the issues that you are raising. That's not the issue. The issue is that you are alienating support. And why did you stop the M25 protests?
We are not alienating support. As you can see, many banks are pulling out of fossil fuel funding. Insurers are getting cold feet on supporting fossil fuel projects.
But do you believe that's down to you?
The Labour Party is now pushing this as one of their 5 key policies. And yes, I don't think it is a coincidence that after 1 year
You're finding a causal relationship between the decisions of these
the
big
fact
corporations.
that we have been in many, many media studios talking like this, talking about the need to end new oil and gas. 2 of my friends are currently sat in prison for cumulatively over 6 years. Many people have blocked oil tankers. They've spent time in police custody. They've disrupted supporting matches. And we have seeded this issue onto the public agenda. And I do believe that it's not just Stop Oil, it's the hard work of the climate movement and of journalists who are prepared to actually talk about this issue. That's how we create change.
Indigo,
That's what I
is there
really
a danger
do
that,
believe.
I mean, look, what the polling suggests that the public agree with you. We can all agree. The climate crisis is an existential threat. And it is a huge problem that needs policymakers agree with that, politicians agree with that, the public agree with that. Is there not a danger that that argument has essentially been won, and that by continuing, particularly the action in terms of disrupting people's lives, not so much the stuff that we've talked about in the snooker halls and sporting events and so on, but stuff like John was saying, closing the M25 and so on, that actually just in the end puts off and deters and irritates and alienates a group of people who already agree with you.
Who might agree with you.
Who already agree with you.
There's just absolutely no data to show that. The data is showing the opposite, that radical action is increasing support for more moderate climate groups. That's polling that's done just before and after at the blocking of the M25 and just before and after us blocking the oil depots. Now, I'm looking at the people who are in power and I'm asking them to create change. It's not happening. Instead, they've trashed our economy. They've pumped sewage into the rivers. They've pushed for new airports.
Do you understand that we do have a democratic process?
Yeah,
I mean, you can understand we do have a democratic process. I just want to put this point. We do have a democratic process. We've got political parties. You can stand for election. You can stand as a Just Stop Oil party. You can stand as the Net Zero party. You're trying to circumvent that process. Instead of putting pressure on politicians by, you can join the Labour Party, you can join the Green Party.
Surely you know that protest is a key part of a flourishing democracy.
But of course, and we can all agree again, completely support the right to protest. There is a difference, though, a political difference between protest, going on a march, which look at what trade unions do. They notify the authorities what they're doing. They either go on a march, they go on a strike. We've seen that this week. We all know it's coming. And what sometimes you do, which is unnotified action to block infrastructure that affects people's lives. There is a difference between protest and that.
No, that's not what the law says. It says that these are acts of protest, that they should be,
I mean, I'm listening to you and you're saying I know best, and that the Just Stop Oil protesters know best, and screw the rest of you.
No, I'm saying I've even stood up in the High Court where they've said that the actions of blocking the M25 and of blocking oil depots are acts of protest.
But you are saying we know that we can disrupt people's lives. Anyone could disrupt people's lives. You can go out and do what you like, block a road and causes mayhem for people just trying to go about their everyday lives. It is that you know best that this is the only way. Where we have protests, we have elections, you can make your representations.
It's not just me who's saying this. That's why thousands of people are flocking to our website to have their donations doubled by Energy founder Dale Vince, and that you can see that support for the campaign and for the demand is growing.
Indigo is right about one thing, though, isn't she, John? Which is that, I mean, she's here. They're across all the radio studios and television studios, and probably if they just went on a normal protest, they probably wouldn't be, right? That is correct.
But I think we can debate effective protest. I mean, I thought that the best thing that happened for the anti-monarchy protesters was the disgraceful arrest of them.
And you were
on that day.
At the coronation, weren't you, Indigo?
Yes, I was held for 16 hours in police custody.
What were you trying to do? What did you do? What prompted your arrest?
So I was stood at the barrier waiting for the procession to come past, and I was going to show a small sort of tea towel-sized banner.
Right.
That said Just Stop Oil. But while I was stood there just in my plain clothes with this in my pocket, I was surrounded by police and handcuffed behind my back and marched up to Charing Cross police station.
What's the end game for your group? What's next? What's the future? More of the same?
So
expansion of action?
As soon as that demand becomes legislation, that's game over. That's the end of Just Stop Oil. So the Tory government could stop the actions tomorrow if
Keir Starmer's pledged to
Yeah.
not have any new oil extraction in the North Sea, or that seems to be what Labour's policy is going to be. So if Labour
It's a
did
real
that...
victory for civil disobedience, and if Labour makes that law, we'll end the campaign. But we know that the only thing that's going to make them actually make this law, rather than being another pledge that they just row back on, is a real and strong street movement holding them to account. And that's why everybody listening today should consider jumping on the Just Stop Oil website and signing up to join us on the streets.
Well, Indigo, pleasure meeting you. Thanks so
you
much
very
for coming in.
Thank you.
You.
All right. I thought that interview was interesting on a lot of levels. I thought when you pointed out that some of what she was saying sounded really frenzied. I mean, she's got a very gentle, quiet voice. But there's also a hint of menace about, look, if we don't get what we want from the Labour government, we will cause merry hell, and we're going to hold people's feet to the flames. And there was that as well.
Yeah. Look, I think, like I said during the interview, I mean, part of me, I like people who have very strongly held political beliefs. You know, as someone who loves politics, is interested in politics, I'm attracted to that. I like that. And I admire principle and dedication to it. But I do think that we saw in that interview the disconnect potentially with a lot of the public. And I do think on two things. One, on that point around her saying, and actually I believe her when she said that even if blocking a road affected potentially the sort of mortal health of her own mother, she would understand. As we pointed out, I think most people would find that baffling and completely alienating, actually, because it is just not how the vast majority of people think. It is it's so ideological. It's so deeply ideological that it is quite off-putting. And then I think the other thing is, and I think this is more of a kind of, I expected her to say, when I put the question
About abortion,
I expected her to say, no, that's different because it's not about systemic risk. Because earlier in the interview, she said that this is a situation without parallel. But she basically conceded that there are analogous situations, that basically it is up to the individual or group to sort of determine for themselves how deeply they feel about it and how subjectively big a thing they think it is. And although obviously there isn't anything subjective about the climate crisis, it is still subjective as to whether or not you think it warrants the action that they are taking. And I think, as you correctly pointed out, John, that road could potentially lead you to just consistent chaos, because ultimately any group could choose
can
to
take the
believe
law
that.
into its own hands if it feels strongly enough. And that's the point of living in a rule of law, civilised society, is that you can't do that.
No.
Because that way lies mayhem and anarchy.
And I think clearly there are examples throughout history where civil disobedience is clearly justified because one particular group is being discriminated against within the confines of the law, i.e. the law itself is unjust. So if we think about what happened in apartheid South Africa, or
Segregation
in America, or the civil rights situation in Northern Ireland in the 1960s and so on, we can clearly see examples where civil disobedience, not violence necessarily, but certainly civil disobedience can be justified. Obviously with this, it isn't that any group is being targeted or justified. What they're actually saying is that this is a totalising thing. We're all being affected. It affects the whole world. The whole world is at risk. And in those circumstances, I think it's harder to see the path through which significant civil disobedience, which is significantly disruptive, I think it is harder to justify. It might not be impossible, but it basically comes down to that subjective point that we feel, we demand that it must be done.
But also then you got the bigger argument that they're making, which is just stop oil. And you think, well, okay, what would that mean if tomorrow we had no oil in our economy? We would have no plastics, we would have medicines that would be severely compromised, we would have no mobility, we would have... it's just...
Well, the lights would go off.
The lights would go off. And so you would be taking society to a very different place. Now, the case that is being made... And actually, it's interesting that, you know, on this podcast over the months, we look at various aspects of policy where there have been shortcomings and where Britain may have fallen behind other places in the world, and actually on climate change and dealing with the effects of, you know, and CO2 emissions. There's a good story to tell in the UK.
Yeah, one thing I slightly worry about with the kind of deeply apocalyptic messaging that we hear is, in a way, I worry that, if anything, it is a disincentive to action. In the sense that it sounds as if the situation is so apocalyptic and so beyond hope that actually everyone just thinks, you know what, I might as well take that flight. I might as well. What's the point in adjusting my behaviour? What's the point in trying to get politicians to adjust their behaviour? Because actually the situation is clearly just so completely grave and apocalyptic. And I slightly worry that tone, and also that sense in which there is a slight part of that movement, in fairness to them, they're saying they just don't want new extraction necessarily, rather than stopping all fossil fuels immediately. But sometimes there is a rather kind of hair shirt kind of image of some of these groups. And there is the critique and attack of their opponents, which basically say they just want us all to go back and live in a cave. And I always think it's very hard sometimes, and they don't all say this, but some do say basically, well, we've all got to transform our lives completely. And that is a very difficult sell to Western populations or populations across the world who have become accustomed to a certain standard of living. And I can't think of any political movement in history which has been successful, which has basically told people they have to have worse standards of living. I think ultimately the solution to this has to come through technology, and it does have to come through pressure on governments. I think governments could be doing a lot more. But as you said, John, there is a question as to whether or not, frankly, populations are already there in their belief that this is a problem, and how much extra benefit there is in disrupting their lives as part of that. I don't know. But like we said in the interview, in fairness, they do get a lot of attention, and they get a lot of attention partly because of their actions.
But where I wonder, and what I question, is whether there is any causal relationship between what they're doing, Just Stop Oil, this group of protesters who block roads or whatever, and the fact that the Labour Party is now going to say no new extraction. I think that wouldn't the Labour Party have reached that independently? And I just think that they are self-aggrandising a tiny bit to say it is their protest that has brought about this change.
Just finally, I suppose the thing that is slightly worrying is that question of, we're trying to get to it at the end, where is the line? And there is a slight problem around when someone believes something is so existential, almost anything can be justified in its name. So I remember when there was a controversy over, it didn't actually happen, but various priceless works of art were being, people were throwing paint at them in museums and so on. Actually, usually they have a glass front, so it was protected. But I remember when some people were being asked about that, they were saying, what's a piece of art by comparison to the future of the world? And in a sense, I know what they mean. I can see what they're getting at. But again, that sort of totalising logic means that almost anything could be justified. Whereas, of course, the actual answer, it seems to me, in that is, well, of course, by comparison to the whole world, it is nothing. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't want to preserve these extraordinary works of art. So I think it's the sort of uncompromising nature of the logic, the sort of relentless, everything coming back to that point, that the world is going to be destroyed, and therefore anything can be justified in its name, which is itself, the idea that the world is going to be destroyed, itself contested and problematic.
Yeah, but I think the thing that sticks with me is her poor mum, that they would be prepared to sacrifice the life of somebody, stop them getting to hospital because the cause is so important, and yet they say they're a non-violent organisation. I think there are some contradictions. I think that some of their protests are highly effective. And as I said in the interview, I think a lot of it is very, very counterproductive.